On the 14th of February 1806, Marshal André Massena, leader of French military operations in southern Italy, rode triumphantly into the city of Naples. The Kingdom of Naples and Sicily had gone to war with France the previous September, and was buoyed in the months that followed by the arrival of a joint Anglo-Russian expeditionary force to southern Italy to aid the Neapolitans against any potential French attack. But all had turned sour that winter. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, had won a crushing victory over the Austrians and Russians at the Battle of Austerlitz, effectively bringing the War of the Third Coalition to an end, while Massena had secured control over northern and central Italy. As the Austrians quickly negotiated yet another humiliating treaty with France, Naples suddenly found itself isolated, and the British and Russians began to evacuate their forces as the prospect of a major French assault on southern Italy loomed. King Ferdinand I of Naples and his family abandoned their capital and headed for Sicily in January, just as Massena was preparing to lead the army of Naples into the region it had been named after. Within a week of his campaign beginning, he entered the great city in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, while on the 9th of March 1806, a French army under Jean Reynier destroyed what remained of the Neapolitan army. Then came perhaps the most shocking moment in the invasion of Naples, as Joseph Bonaparte, the older brother of the emperor, was made King of Naples in late March 1806. Such was the manner in which Napoleon Bonaparte extended his grip over new parts of Europe in an almost casual fashion by the mid-1800s. His victory over the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily in the spring of 1806, and the obliteration of the Austrian threat the previous autumn and winter aside, Napoleon still faced numerous antagonists across Europe as the summer of 1806 dawned. Unlike the War of the First Coalition, which came to an end in 1797, with really only Britain continuing the struggle against France, and the War of the Second Coalition, a conflict which resulted in a year of nearly complete peace across Europe, as the British and French established a ceasefire through the Peace of Amiens in 1802, the War of the Third Coalition had no clear end to it. While Austria and Naples had been comprehensively defeated within months of the war commencing in the summer of 1805, Russia was still at war with the French, and despite Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz in early December 1805, the British had no intention of establishing peace terms again with France. Sweden, which had allied with Britain back in December 1804, also remained theoretically at war with the French Empire, although little by way of direct conflict between the two nations had yet occurred. Consequently, there was no clear end to the War of the Third Coalition, and it would soon morph into the War of the Fourth Coalition. If there was something which distinguishes the War of the Third Coalition from the War of the Fourth Coalition, it was the decision by Prussia, which had remained neutral in 1805 when Austria and Russia joined Britain in the new conflict, to now ally with Britain, Russia, and Sweden against France. The ruler of Prussia, King Frederick William III, a prevaricating and weak ruler, was convinced by his wife, the strong-willed Queen Louisa, that Prussia's position as a rising power in Europe was now fatally threatened by France as a result of Napoleon's utter defeat of Austria and decision to dismantle the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire early in 1806. The replacement of the Holy Roman Empire with the Confederation of the Rhine, a French puppet state in western Germany, in the summer of 1806, further concerned the Prussians. Additionally, when undertaking the Ulm campaign against the Austrians in the autumn of 1805, Bonaparte had led his armies through Prussian territory in order to encircle the Austrian position in southern Germany. This was a clear violation of Prussian neutrality and caused considerable hostility in Berlin. With all of these factors taken into account, King Frederick William finally determined that he needed to go to war with France, and in October 1806, he declared war on Bonaparte, after a series of demands, which included the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine, were rejected by Napoleon. The Prince-Elector of Saxony, in eastern Germany, joined Prussia in the war, so that in the War of the Fourth Coalition, which now developed, France faced Britain, Russia, and Sweden, who were all still at war with France from the War of the Third Coalition, as well as Prussia and Saxony. The decision to go to war with the French would prove to be a catastrophic strategic blunder for Prussia. At the time of the declaration, Napoleon and the French still had tens of thousands of men in Central Europe, as Bonaparte sought to follow up his victory over Austria by securing full control over the territories held by Britain in northern Germany, by right of the British Royal House of Hanover being the electors of Hanover in Germany as well. Consequently, the French were well placed to deploy their forces immediately against the Prussians. Indeed, even before Prussia declared war on France, Napoleon had begun mobilizing La Grande Armée to march on Berlin, predicting that Frederick William's declaration of hostilities was imminent. Thus, he began marching with some 65,000 troops towards Saxony, with corps commanded by several of his leading marshals, including Jean de Dieu Soult, who had led the charge against the Austrian lines at Austerlitz the previous winter, the cavalry commander Michel Ney, and Louis-Nicolas Davout, who had commanded a cavalry rear guard at Austerlitz that had arrived at just the right time to plug the right flank against an Austro-Russian attack on that occasion. The decisive engagements of the war with Prussia would occur on the 14th of October, less than a week after the conflict was entered into. It occurred in two separate clashes on the same day in the region to the southwest of the city of Leipzig. The two locations were next to the town of Jena and further to the north at Auerstadt. Napoleon commanded the bulk of the French forces at Jena, some 40,000 men in all, while Davout oversaw the French army at Auerstadt to the north. As with so many other pivotal military clashes of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the French were outnumbered at both Jena and Auerstadt. Indeed, on the 14th of October 1806, Davout was considerably so, with the Prussians and their Saxon allies fielding upwards of 60,000 men there, against a corps of just over 25,000 commanded by Davout. At Jena, Napoleon was only marginally outnumbered, with 55,000 Prussian and Saxon troops under the command of Prince Frederick Louis of Hohenlohe and Ernst von Rüchel. The battle nearly turned disastrous for the French early in the morning, when Marshal Ney led a large cavalry detachment against the Prussian lines without any order to do so from Napoleon. This foolhardy move resulted in the corps being nearly surrounded by the Prussians and Saxon troops before Bonaparte ordered Marshal Lannes to lead a detachment to rescue Ney and his men. At that juncture, if the Prussians had pressed their advantage and launched a frontal assault on the main French forces, they would have won the day. But indecision prevailed, and in the hours that followed, the Prussians fell prey to sustained French fire. This, combined with French attacks on the Prussian flanks, resulted in a bloodbath as the afternoon progressed, while to the north at Auerstadt, a disastrous deployment of Prussian troops in the morning had led to a complete rout, despite the numerical disadvantage Davout and the French had. By the time the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt ended that evening, the Prussians and Saxons had suffered tens of thousands of casualties in killed and wounded, while approximately 20,000 more men had been captured. But these were not pain-free victories for the French. Unlike at Marengo, Ulm, or Austerlitz in times gone by, the French suffered over 12,000 casualties. Nevertheless, the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt was cataclysmic for the Prussians, and as with the victory at Ulm a year earlier against the Austrians, the defeat of the main Prussian army left Berlin open to an assault by Napoleon in the late autumn of 1806. The weeks that followed witnessed a collapse of the Prussian war effort. 2 days after Napoleon's victory at Jena, Marshal Murat had a Prussian force capitulate to him at Erfurt, slightly to the southwest. By now, the Prussians were desperately seeking peace terms on as favorable grounds as they could obtain, but Bonaparte was unwilling to accept anything other than a complete surrender, and had already begun preparing for the annexation of Prussian territory and creation of new French vassal states in Central Europe. On the 17th of October, Marshal Bernadotte crushed one of the last large Prussian field armies at the Battle of Halle, just 150 kilometers from Berlin. By the 24th of October, the French had advanced as far as Potsdam, the town just 25 kilometers to the southwest of the Prussian capital, Berlin. It capitulated without much resistance, as did Spandau, in what are now the suburbs of Berlin the following day. By then, King Frederick William and the Prussian royal family had fled to the port city of Memel, which was then a part of Prussia, but which is in Lithuania today. There the Prussian king desperately sought Russian aid against the French. On the 27th of October, Napoleon marched into Berlin, which had been partially occupied by Marshal Davout the previous day. As the French cavalry rode through the Brandenburg Gate, the French settled into conquering the second great capital of Central Europe in just under a year. With defeat at Jena Auerstadt and the fall of Berlin in October 1806, Prussian involvement in the War of the Fourth Coalition was all but over. Yet Napoleon still needed to vanquish the Swedes and the Russians, whose troop build-ups in Poland and other neighboring regions had continued throughout the autumn of 1806. Aware of this, Napoleon began having proclamations issued from Berlin in late October and early November, calling on the people of Poland, whose nation had been dismembered and annexed by Prussia, Russia, and Austria in 3 partitions in 1772, 1792, and 1795, to rise up against Prussian and Russian tyranny. This was responded to when General Jan Henryk Dąbrowski, a Polish nationalist, initiated the Greater Poland Uprising in early November in the Poznań region of western Poland. Meanwhile, after a brief respite to rest in Berlin and gather his forces, Napoleon began a campaign in East Prussia, in what are now northwestern Poland and the Baltic states, in December 1806. Campaigning would continue into the spring of 1807, as the French and the Russians, aided by their various allies, attempted to gain the strategic advantage in the region. In an attritional campaign, the French gradually gained the upper hand, symbolized by the commencement of a siege of the port city of Danzig in mid-March and its eventual fall to the French in May 1807. The Eastern Campaign would eventually culminate in the Battle of Friedland on the 14th of June 1807, an engagement near the modern-day town of Pravdinsk in the Kaliningrad Oblast. As with the Battle of Ulm over a year and a half earlier, Napoleon found himself in the unusual position of outnumbering the enemy here. The French had campaigned well into the Baltic region, with a force of 80,000 men, though in the end 15,000 of these would be held in reserve, as Bonaparte only utilized 65,000 at Friedland. By way of contrast, the Allied army, which was overwhelmingly made up of Russian forces, consisted of approximately 55,000 troops under the command of Levin August von Bennigsen, a German general in Russian employ, who had earned a considerable reputation for slowing the French advance into East Prussia and the Baltic region during several battles in the early spring of 1807. At Friedland, though, he was completely outmatched by Napoleon. As both armies sought to take control of the town of Heinrichsdorf in the region, the Russians became trapped on the western side of the River Wena, with their pontoons to cross back over the river compromised. Faced with this situation, von Bennigsen had no option but to form up and meet Napoleon's army full on. Bonaparte responded by pulling up a force of 40,000 men in the center and unleashing a heavy artillery bombardment on the Russians. This was followed quickly by a cavalry assault by Marshal Ney. In the period that followed, the Russian lines faltered and then broke under heavy fire. With no easy exit over the River Wena, the retreat became extremely disordered, and massive casualties were suffered, in many instances as Russian detachments were picked off as they attempted to wade over the river. By the end of the Battle of Friedland, the French had suffered upwards of 10,000 killed and wounded, but over half of the Russian army of roughly 55,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured. French victory at the Battle of Friedland effectively spelled the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition. In its immediate aftermath, Tsar Alexander of Russia sent envoys to the French and sought to negotiate peace terms with Napoleon. The resulting peace treaty, which was agreed between France and Russia near the town of Tilsit in what was then East Prussia, but which is now the town of Sovietsk in the Russian-controlled Kaliningrad Oblast, involved one of the most famous meetings of two emperors in world history. On the 7th of July 1807, Napoleon and Alexander met near the town on a raft in the middle of the nearby Neman River. This was the border between Prussia and Russia, and had Napoleon advanced any further, he would have been invading the Russian Empire. There, they agreed to the first half of the Treaty of Tilsit. This not only established peace between France and Russia, but through it, Napoleon and Alexander became secret allies. Bonaparte agreed to aid the Tsar in Russia's quest to capitalize on the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, while in return, the Russian Emperor promised his French counterpart that he would wage war on Sweden, which was still holding out with Britain against the French. Finally, Napoleon reassured Alexander that he would not interfere with the ruling houses of several small German states, such as the Duchy of Oldenburg, whose rulers were relatives of Alexander, a Russian ruler of largely German descent. The meeting at Tilsit between Napoleon and Alexander was one of the most important diplomatic encounters between two monarchs in modern history. Luckily, we have some extensive descriptions of it. Bonaparte, allegedly, had won over Alexander before they ever stepped onto the raft. When they met, they embraced, and then Alexander stated, "I will be your second against England." While he may have been willing to accept British financing for the wars against France, there was no love lost between Russia and Britain, two powers who would increasingly clash over jurisdictions in Central Asia in the decades ahead, as Russia sought to expand southwards into Persia and Afghanistan, and Britain sought to secure these regions as a buffer for the British Raj. As Napoleon later stated of Alexander's opening gambit, quote, "Those words changed everything." The two emperors then proceeded alone into the salon and discussed matters alone for 2 hours. Napoleon would subsequently report back to his wife Josephine about Alexander after the meeting. "I am very well satisfied with him. He is a very handsome and good young emperor. He had more intelligence than one thinks." Such was the manner in which the famous meeting at Tilsit occurred. 2 days later, it was the turn of King Frederick William of Prussia to agree terms with Napoleon. Bonaparte was not so sanguine in how he dealt with the Prussian ruler. This second part of the Treaty of Tilsit inflicted a crushing set of surrender terms on the once proud German state. Prussia was stripped of half of its territory. Some of its lands in the west and central Germany were allocated towards the establishment of a new kingdom of Westphalia, the latest in the French client states created since 1795. To the east, an enormous portion of Prussian territory, albeit much of it having been acquired during the recent partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 1770s and 1790s, was taken from Prussia and formed into a new Grand Duchy of Warsaw, covering much of the southern and central regions of modern-day Poland. The title of Duke of Warsaw was handed to King Frederick Augustus I of Saxony, whose family had a decades-old claim to the Polish throne and who now became a stalwart French ally. But the duchy was effectively another French vassal state, extending Napoleonic power in Europe to Warsaw and beyond. As an added humiliation, Prussia was forced to pay an enormous war indemnity and was forbidden from maintaining an army of more than 43,000 soldiers. Indeed, Napoleon had even arranged to humiliate the Prussian ruler at Tilsit. making him wait on the shore of the Niemen, while Alexander and Bonaparte discussed the fate of Prussia, and afterwards, when the settlements had been reached, lodging the Tsar in a local mansion and having the Prussian king sent to stay in the house of a local miller. King Frederick William was broken by the humiliating terms, a development worsened by the premature death of his much-loved wife, Queen Louisa, in 1810, a woman whom Napoleon, a stalwart sexist throughout his life, respectfully described as the Prussian king's most accomplished minister. Yet, there were individuals within Prussia who doggedly set about reforming what remained of their state and army in the aftermath of Tilsit, and Prussia would rise phoenix-like from the ashes to haunt Napoleon in years to come. The twin treaties of Tilsit between France and Russia and Prussia were a disaster for Britain and its sole remaining ally, Sweden. The government of the Duke of Portland in London was now concerned about the possibility that Napoleon would move to seize the considerable fleet possessed by Denmark-Norway, which in early modern times was ruled as a dual monarchy, and possibly use this to supplement the French and Spanish fleets as the basis for a renewed attempt to invade Britain, plans which had been scuppered in 1805 after the French defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar. Accordingly, the British launched what became known as the Gunboat War in August 1807, just weeks after the Treaty of Tilsit was finalized, preemptively attacking Copenhagen and trying to seize as much Danish and Norwegian shipping as possible. This attack on one of the few European states which had remained almost entirely neutral throughout the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars was immediately utilized as a means for Russia to justify declaring war on Britain, as Alexander I sought to honor his new alliance with the French. Thus, where just a year earlier Britain had been at the head of a new coalition against the French, which included Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Saxony, in the autumn of 1807, it faced an unprecedentedly bleak scenario. Much of Western and Central Europe was now either ruled directly by Napoleon or through vassal states like the Kingdom of Italy and Confederation of the Rhine. Austria and Prussia had been completely neutralized by the French. Russia had allied with Napoleon, as had Saxony, while the new Duchy of Warsaw extended Bonaparte's influence into Eastern Europe. Only Sweden remained as a British ally, though the government in London had incurred the enmity of Denmark-Norway through its efforts to preemptively seize the country's fleet. It was a desperate situation for the British, and Napoleon was virtually unrivaled as the master of Europe. Napoleon was determined to drive home his advantage in the aftermath of Tilsit. While he had decided that an invasion of Britain was impractical in the short term, a new method of attacking Britain had presented itself with his conquest of Central Europe and the favorable negotiating position he found himself in with regard to the Russians at Tilsit. Already while ensconced in Berlin in November 1806, Bonaparte had issued what is known as the Berlin Decree, whereby he ordered a blanket prohibition on the import of British goods or British carried goods into France or any of its vassal states or the ports of its allies. This was expanded at Tilsit to become the Continental System, which the Russians agreed to abide by. With this, most of Europe's ports theoretically prohibited trade with Britain. Napoleon's goal was clear. Britain controlled the high seas, and as an island nation was almost impossible for the French to defeat without a commensurately powerful navy. No invasion of Britain could realistically be mounted by Bonaparte following the defeat at Trafalgar in 1805. But Britain's power was also economic and based on its mass control over world trade and the ability to sell its manufactured goods to foreign countries. With the Continental System, Napoleon hoped to strike a huge economic blow against the British, one which would cripple the country's ability to continue to wage war against France and to bankroll other nations like Austria to do likewise, as it had been doing almost without interruption since 1792. The Treaty of Tilsit did have one negative impact on France's position. Napoleon had never fully abandoned his fanciful plans to lead an army eastwards through the Middle East and Central Asia to attack the British position in India, hopes which had underlain his expedition to Egypt in 1798. He had courted the Sultan in Constantinople and the Persian Empire in what is now Iran throughout the early 1800s, and following the resounding defeat of Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805, Selim III, the Ottoman Sultan, had informed the Russian government that he would not ratify a proposed treaty with them. Instead, he aligned himself with Napoleon. A similar diplomatic agreement had been reached with Persia as Fath Ali Shah agreed an alliance with France early in 1807. These were useful alliances for France while Napoleon was at war with Russia, which had lengthy border connections with the Ottomans and Persians in the Black Sea, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the region east of the Caspian Sea. But the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit completely upended this regional diplomatic situation. As part of the treaty, Bonaparte had agreed to aid the Tsar in his conflicts in Asia, and so, in the second half of 1807, France's alliances with both the Ottomans and the Persians collapsed. Hence, one often overlooked element of the Treaty of Tilsit was that it ended, once and for all, any hopes Napoleon might have still been entertaining about marching eastwards, overland, to invade British India, like some latter-day Alexander the Great, one of the emperor's heroes. Napoleon's time in Eastern Europe was significant on a personal level also. While there, he became romantically involved with Marie Walewska, a daughter of Count Mathieu Waczynski, a prominent landholder in the Gostin region. Their first encounter seems to have been by accident, when Napoleon was campaigning in East Prussia and stopped at an inn to have the horses pulling his carriage replaced. Marie happened to be there, and evidently made enough of an impression on him that later, at a gathering of the Polish nobility in Warsaw, he requested her to attend him. Their relationship began from there, and Walewska was evidently a considerable influence on Napoleon's decision to create the Duchy of Warsaw as a resurrection of the Polish state. It was a curious relationship, though, and the manner in which Napoleon shelved it after he left Poland is revelatory of how Bonaparte's mind worked. When he left Eastern Europe and returned to France in the autumn of 1807, he sent Marie a portrait of himself along with a package of some books. Included with these was a note in which he stated, quote, "My gentle and dear Marie, you who love your country so much will understand the joy I feel at being back in France after nearly a year away. This joy would be complete had you been here too, but I carry you in my heart." Napoleon did not write to her for another year and a half. Such was the manner in which the Emperor of the French could seemingly disentangle himself from any relationships he engaged in. With the finalization of the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon found himself in a position of unprecedented power across Europe. It was also the most peaceful period he had enjoyed since the termination of the Peace of Amiens in 1803 and the subsequent development of the War of the Third Coalition. By the autumn of 1807, only Britain and Sweden were at war with France, and both powers were overseas to all intents and purposes, with the English Channel and the Baltic Sea prohibiting Napoleon from invading their nations. In this relative respite from war, Bonaparte once again turned to domestic affairs back in France and the vassal territories in regions like the Low Countries, Western Germany, and Italy. Numerous civil and administrative reforms were introduced by the emperor during this period. For instance, in early September 1807, he commanded that money could not be loaned out at interest rates of more than 5% for civil causes and 6% for trading purposes. The French Commercial Code was also introduced a week after this dispensation, introducing elements of commercial law to France and its territories, which in some cases, such as in Poland, would remain in force until well into the 20th century. Just days later, a court of auditors was instituted in Paris by Bonaparte. The period back in Paris after the War of the Fourth Coalition also saw Napoleon set eyes at last on a painting which he had commissioned shortly after becoming emperor. Bonaparte had formed a close relationship with Jacques-Louis David, the preeminent French painter of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, who had earlier been closely allied with Maximilien Robespierre in the early 1790s. David had tied his star to Napoleon's after he became first consul in 1799, and in 1801 had painted his first famous depiction of Bonaparte, a highly stylized portrayal of him crossing the Saint-Bernard Pass in the Alps on horseback, a celebration of his campaign against Austria the previous year, an ultimate victory at Marengo. Now, in January 1808, David unveiled the coronation of Napoleon, a 20-foot by 32-foot panoramic depiction of Napoleon's coronation in Notre Dame back in 1804. David spent 2 years working on what is widely recognized as one of the most accomplished pieces of historical painting ever produced, even going so far as to have schematic drawings of Notre Dame produced for him to work from, and having individuals who were present at the coronation in 1804 called to his studio so that he could paint them into the picture. When it was complete, Napoleon came to view it at David's studio. After staring at the canvas for about an hour, he turned to the painter and said, "David, I salute you." The emperor paid him 24,000 francs, a small fortune in early 19th century terms, and David retained ownership of the painting until 1819, when it was sent to the Royal Museums. There were, however, more pedantic and childish episodes which Napoleon was capable of. For instance, in September 1807, he ordered that the American consul in Genoa, Peter Kuhn, should be arrested on account of his having been reported as wearing the insignia of the Order of Malta, which had been awarded to him by the British. Around the same time, Napoleon was spending tens of thousands of francs bailing some court officials out of trouble with their mistresses, while it was also, in September 1807, that he wrote to the local municipal government in Bordeaux to inquire why the aristocrats and other prominent figures there had not attended a ball thrown by Senator Lamartiliere. Often, these forays into the minutiae of government could take on a bizarre note. It was also around this time that Napoleon became extremely concerned about the alleged poisoning of a Mademoiselle Pascal from the city of Montpellier in southern France in 1805. Rumors abounded that her husband, Jean-Guillaume, had been responsible for her demise. Napoleon ordered that the case be reopened and even ordered that a post-mortem should be carried out on Pascal's deceased dog to see if it too had been poisoned. Hence Napoleon, for all that he was master of much of Europe and famed today as a general, could become distracted by rather minor issues of government when time allowed. It would be all too easy to view Napoleon as simply a general turned emperor. While he had little time to entertain his passions, the inquisitive man who had read voraciously as an artillery student back in the 1780s was still alive and well. His interests were perhaps seen most clearly during the 1800s in his love of the theatre. During the 15 years between when he became first consul back in 1799 and his ultimate downfall on 2 occasions a decade and a half later, he saw no less than 374 plays, though he visited the theatre in excess of 600 times, often seeing the same play on multiple occasions. The record was for Cena, a play written by Pierre Corneille in 1641 and based on a conspiracy to assassinate the Emperor Caesar Augustus, first ruler of Rome. The plot of the play must have resonated with the first emperor of the French, who saw it no less than 12 times. Napoleon once reflected that if Corneille were still alive, he would make him a prince, and with the ease that the emperor declared men to be princes in the 1800s, such a claim was probably quite accurate. Yet Bonaparte also saw the theatre as a political tool, and while he may have visited on an almost nightly basis when in Paris, he also established censors to ensure that the political messaging emanating from France's most popular form of entertainment in the early 19th century was in line with his wishes as the country's ruler. Napoleon's jest that he might have made the author of Cena a French prince was perhaps pertinent by the late 1800s. Indeed, perhaps Corneille would have done a better job than some of those who Napoleon did promote to positions as royalty. As negative as the signs were concerning Napoleon's promotion of his family members to positions of great power across Western and Central Europe by 1807, Bonaparte was about to enter into a period of increased nepotism in the aftermath of the War of the Fourth Coalition. The source of these changes was found in the Iberian Peninsula. Here, Spain had been a strong ally of France since King Charles IV had switched sides during the War of the First Coalition in the mid-1790s. Over the next decade, the Spanish had been a major supporter of French naval activities in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. But its near neighbour was a different matter. Portugal had been an ally of Britain's since the 1660s, and while the Portuguese had been reluctant to enter directly into the wars against France, the government there continued to trade with Britain to the irritation of Napoleon once the continental system was conceived of and implemented. With victory over Prussia and Russia in the summer of 1807, Napoleon determined to do something about this Iberian issue, and in October he agreed the Treaty of Fontainebleau with Charles IV of Spain. The terms of it were relatively simple, but momentous for future events. France and Spain would invade Portugal together and remove the ruling house of Braganza. The country would then be carved up into different principalities, with Spain annexing some and Napoleon creating yet another vassal state in the north of the country called the Kingdom of North Lusitania. Later, it was proposed that Portugal's colonies would be seized and divided between France and Spain. Steps were taken very quickly to implement the articles contained in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. On the 19th of November 1807, just 3 weeks after the agreement was reached between France and Spain, a joint Franco-Spanish invasion of Portugal involving approximately 50,000 troops under the command of Jean-Anduche Junot was commenced. The Portuguese government was weakened by a lack of leadership. Queen Maria I had been the reigning monarch since 1777, but her mental state had deteriorated from the late 1780s onwards, and the country was effectively governed by her son, Dom John of Braganza, as regent from the late 1790s onwards. It was partially because of this politically unstable situation that Portugal had played no major part in the wars against France. Now, in the face of a French invasion, the government of Dom John in Lisbon simply decided to flee. Little resistance was offered as the French and Spanish marched through Portugal. But when Junot's forces arrived in Lisbon and entered the city on the 30th of November, less than 2 weeks after the commencement of the invasion, they found the government and royal family had fled to Brazil, Portugal's enormous colony in South America. The French and the Spanish carved up Portugal thereafter in line with the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. But unlike previous conquests, Napoleon had to contend with there being a Portuguese government in exile in Brazil that upheld their claim as rightful rulers of the Iberian nation. Within weeks of the invasion and occupation of Portugal, the Spanish government of Charles IV in Madrid began to realize that the Treaty of Fontainebleau had been a Faustian pact. Napoleon now intended to treat Spain much like the rest of France's vassal states. Within weeks, French troops were crossing the Pyrenees and garrisoning Basque and Catalonian towns and cities such as San Sebastian, Pamplona, and Barcelona. This caused enormous unrest in Spain, and in the middle of March 1808, uprisings broke out in the suburbs of Madrid against the government of Charles IV. In response, Napoleon ordered French troops into Madrid. Charles IV was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, who became King Ferdinand VII of Spain on the 19th of March. However, Ferdinand's reign was very short-lived. On the 2nd of May, a fresh insurrection, known as the Dos de Mayo Uprising, or 2nd of May Uprising, broke out in Madrid, owing to continued disaffection amongst the Spanish populace at the French occupation of the city. Bonaparte took this as the opportunity to fully seize control of Spain. Additional French forces were sent into Madrid and the other cities. Ferdinand was forced to abdicate, and in June, Joseph Bonaparte Napoleon's older brother and, since 1806, the King of Naples, was announced as the new King of Spain. It was the beginning of a period of intense difficulty for the French Emperor in Iberia. Napoleon's decision to crown Joseph as King of Spain led to a reorganization of some of the ruling houses of Western and Central Europe. Joseph had been King of Naples since the conquest of southern Italy early in the spring of 1806. He had been relatively popular there on account of an ambitious reform program which he had tried to implement in a country which had been notoriously backwards for decades. He was now replaced in that position by Napoleon's stalwart ally and brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, who had overseen the French military operations in Spain in response to the Dos de Mayo uprising, and who was now rewarded with a kingdom by Napoleon for his long-standing service. But Murat would be unable to devote much time to Naples, in large part owing to his position as one of the marshals of the empire and senior military commander of La Grande Armée. Moreover, Murat had been Grand Duke of Berg in Germany since 1806, and with his switch to Naples, Bonaparte took that title himself, though he was unable to govern there in person or devote much time to the minutiae of affairs in Western Germany. Consequently, the reorganization of rulers in Spain, Naples, and Berg in 1808 produced largely absentee rulers in certain locations. However, the greater issue was in Spain itself, where Joseph was loathed by his new subjects as the representative of a French army of occupation. While the Dos de Mayo uprising had been suppressed, Ferdinand deposed, and a Bonaparte installed as the new king, regional revolts and unrest across Spain continued throughout the summer and autumn of 1808, and it was clear from the outset that this could not be crushed through a simple injection of French troops into the region. That was made clear when a French army of 20,000 men under General Pierre Dupont was soundly defeated and thousands of French soldiers captured at the Battle of Bailén in southern Spain in mid-July. Worse still was the successful opening of a British front in Portugal in the summer of 1808, under the commands of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, and Sir Hugh Dalrymple. Wellesley was an experienced military commander who had served for many years in India in the wars there against the Sultan of Mysore and other native rulers, while he had also been involved in the front in the Low Countries during the War of the First Coalition in the mid-1790s. In him, Napoleon would eventually face his greatest adversary. In the 2 years that followed, what has variously become known as the Peninsular War of the Spanish Ulcer developed across the Iberian Peninsula. It is known as the Spanish Ulcer because it bled the French of resources and slowly inflicted immense damage on Napoleon's empire as a war which seemingly could not be won. This was despite Napoleon's decision to campaign in person with the newly constituted Armée d'Espagne in Spain in the autumn and winter of 1808. But despite winning a series of significant victories, the rebellion had still not been snuffed out in Spain, nor the British ejected from Portugal by the time he left to return to France in the spring of 1809 to deal with growing tensions in Central Europe. King Joseph proved unequal to the task of suppressing the revolts and restoring French control thereafter. And in the course of 1809, Wellesley, who was eventually made the overall commander of the British military expedition in Iberia, effectively liberated Portugal from French occupation. Meanwhile, southern Spain was taken over by elements opposed to the French, and a Cortes of Castile was established as a native government headquartered in the port city of Cadiz in the south, where it was protected by the British fleet. By the end of 1809, the Spanish Ulcer was getting worse and worse for France. While matters in Spain were proving extremely difficult, in northern Europe things were faring much better for Napoleon in 1808. When the Treaty of Tilsit was agreed between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander in the summer of 1807, one of the provisions of it was that Russia would go to war with Sweden, one of only two powers along with Britain which Napoleon was still at war with following the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition. The Russians and the Swedes were traditional enemies, who had fought several wars since the middle of the 17th century for hegemony over the Baltic Sea and lands around the Gulf of Finland and eastwards to Lake Ladoga. Russia had generally emerged from these conflicts with the upper hand and now saw an opportunity to seize Finland from the Swedes. Hence, diplomatic tensions about shipping through the Baltic Sea and the Danish Sound were ratcheted up by Alexander in the winter of 1807, and war was declared early in 1808. The Finnish War would last for a year and a half, with Napoleon nominally supporting his new Russian ally, and the British sending an expeditionary force to Scandinavia. However, it was an unmitigated disaster for the Swedes, whose army was ill-prepared for the war, and which was poorly led by King Gustav IV Adolf. In the autumn of 1808, Russian troops largely overran Finland, despite the Swedes' efforts to establish a series of fortifications there. Then, the Russian armies under their commander Friedrich Wilhelm von Buxhoeveden campaigned through the winter into northern Sweden, taking advantage of the frozen Gulf of Bothnia, parts of which were traversable in the cold weather. By the early spring of 1809, a large Russian army was descending on central Sweden. Faced with this unprecedented crisis in its history, those close to power in Stockholm launched a coup and deposed King Gustav in March 1809, eventually replacing him with his uncle in the early summer, who became King Charles XIII. By then, a ceasefire had been agreed between the leaders of the Swedish military and Russia. This was followed by the Treaty of Fredrikshamn in September, through which Sweden ceded Finland to Russia, which was duly created into the Grand Duchy of Finland with Tsar Alexander, who was taking inspiration from Napoleon's pattern of creating puppet states, as the first Grand Duke. Napoleon signed a separate treaty with the Swedes the following year, according to the terms of which the Swedes agreed to relinquish any ties to Britain and to join the continental system, while just weeks later, one of Napoleon's marshals, Jean Bernadotte, was elected as the Crown Prince of Sweden and heir designate to the throne, Charles XIII having only adopted or illegitimate sons. Though it would prove incidental to Napoleon's career, Bernadotte would eventually succeed the Swedish throne as King Charles XIV John in 1818, founding the House of Bernadotte, which is still the Swedish royal house today, over 2 centuries later. Neither Tsar Alexander nor Napoleon were active participants in the Finnish and Swedish campaigns of 1808 and 1809. Instead, the pair were engaged in various other matters during this period, not least Napoleon, in trying to suppress the major uprisings being seen across Spain. One of his other engagements was a major diplomatic congress with the Russians in the autumn of 1808. The Congress of Erfurt was convened in the city of Erfurt in central Germany between the French and Russian governments to discuss a wide range of matters relating to the new Franco-Russian alliance and dominance of the continent. The Congress was convened at a time when cracks in the agreements reached at Tilsit the previous year were already beginning to show. In particular, the continental system, which forbade Russia from trading with Britain or even with British merchants, was deeply unpopular at home in Russia, as it led to a shortage of luxury commodities amongst the nascent Russian middle class. There were also issues to be resolved concerning Finland, Sweden, Spain, and Austria, the latter of which Napoleon was preparing for war with yet again, this time with the aim of neutralizing it utterly as a power in Central Europe in much the same way he had Prussia during the War of the Fourth Coalition. On the surface, the Congress of Erfurt, which commenced when Napoleon and Alexander met each other outside the town on the 28th of September 1808 and lasted for 2.5 weeks into mid-October, was a convivial affair, with the Emperor and the Tsar dining together every evening, swapping gifts and generally behaving amiably towards one another. The Congress was also punctuated with cultural events, as some of Germany's greatest literary figures, amongst them one of Napoleon's foremost literary heroes, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the first part of whose magnum opus, Faust, had just been published, attended the Imperial Congress at Erfurt. But behind the pomp and the expressions of cordiality were serious divisions between the French and the Russians. Much of this was over the continental system, which Alexander complained was hurting the development of the Russian economy. Conversely, Napoleon became infuriated at certain junctures in the meetings by Russian refusals to allow French customs officers to check goods coming into Eastern Europe's ports to make sure they were not originating from Britain. Behind the shadows, Napoleon's former foreign minister, Talleyrand, was advising Alexander, Talleyrand having come to the conclusion that Bonaparte had become too ambitious in his desires to dominate all of Europe and crush the British. Nevertheless, despite these differences, an agreement was eventually reached, whereby both rulers called on Britain to make peace with France, and Alexander promised Napoleon Russian aid in the event of a future war between the French and the Austrians. Other articles reiterated elements of the Treaty of Tilsit, with Bonaparte affirming his support for Russia's annexation of Finland. Ultimately, though, as the delegates left Erfurt in mid-October, it was clear that the Franco-Russian alliance stood on very shaky ground. The man who Alexander had met at Erfurt was a changed one to the man he had engaged with at Tilsit a year and a half earlier. The manner in which Napoleon was governing Europe and seeking to advance things in the early 1800s was heavy-handed and overly dictatorial. This altered approach was reflected in his physical state. In his youth and throughout much of his 30s, Napoleon, who it should be remembered was still shy of his 40th year when he met Alexander at Erfurt, had been a thin man, almost gaunt given his energy and his naturally small stature. But in the mid-1800s, he gradually began to gain weight, a process which never reversed and accelerated as the years went on. Indeed, his appetite had become prodigious. When presented with a half chicken when dining in Vienna in the late 1800s, he queried what kind of chicken was born with only one leg and one wing before complaining that he was being fed on scraps. First-hand accounts from these years of those who met him often noted his growing corpulence, with his head often hunched downwards from his shoulders. If one were looking for a Shakespearean symbolic slant, one might reflect that the burden of trying to rule Europe was weighing heavily upon him. However, those who met him were still struck by the penetrating intellect he possessed, and while Bonaparte might have increasingly rode in a carriage rather than on a horse, it was well known that he travelled with such speed that water often had to be used to cool down the carriage wheels as he raced across Europe from city to city and battlefront to battlefront. By 1808, an old problem was freshly brewing for Napoleon. The events of the years between 1806 and 1808 had convinced many in Vienna that they needed to act against the French. The example of what had happened to Prussia with the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 worried many within the Austrian government, while Napoleon's decision to effectively get rid of the Spanish royal family and install his brother as ruler of that kingdom demonstrated that Bonaparte was not above such behavior when it came to alleged allies. As such, by 1808, warhawks in Vienna, such as Clemens von Metternich and the foreign minister Johann Philipp Stadion, were adamant that Austria needed to launch a new war against France. This was despite the country's experience of 3 successive defeats by France in the coalition wars in 1797, 1801, and 1805. Yet the view in Vienna was that Napoleon was vulnerable owing to the ongoing war across the Iberian Peninsula, which was pinning down nearly 250,000 troops to fight the British, Spanish, and Portuguese, and Napoleon being simply overextended as he sought to control Europe from Lisbon to Warsaw. It was in this light that the Austrians began preparing for war again in 1808. The War of the Fifth Coalition was preceded by diplomatic efforts by the Austrians to either convince some of the other great European powers to also make war on France, or at least remain broadly neutral. Some of this met with failure. For instance, Austrian efforts to convince Prussia to join a new alliance against Napoleon were in vain. the great North German state having been utterly crushed by Bonaparte in the course of the War of the Fourth Coalition. But the Austrians met with greater success when it came to negotiating with the Russians. Although Tsar Alexander was nominally Napoleon's ally, by the autumn of 1808, despite the diplomatic efforts at Erfurt, the alliance was very shaky. Owing to this, Alexander agreed to clandestine negotiations with the Austrian government that while he would honor his alliance with Bonaparte on paper, he would move very slowly to offer any real military support and ensure that his armies did not actually clash with the Austrians in any meaningful way. With this agreement in place, Stadion and Metternich began efforts to convince the Austrian emperor of the wisdom of war, a feat which they succeeded in by February 1809. With this done, a new coalition was established, consisting of Britain, Austria, and rebels against French rule in Portugal, Spain, and southern Italy. They would face France and its many vassal states in Holland, Germany, the Duchy of Warsaw, and Italy, as well as Bavaria. Although Britain would bankroll much of the conflict, the Austrians would do much of the fighting. With these measures in place, Austria declared war on France and Bavaria on the 3rd of April 1809. A week later, on the 10th of April, Archduke Charles of Austria led an army of 127,000 men over the border into southern Germany. Though by 1809 he was a different man to the one who had triumphed in such spectacular fashion over the Austrians in 1797, and again at Marengo and Austerlitz, Napoleon nevertheless responded to the outbreak of the War of the Fifth Coalition with his usual energy and drive. Though the Austrians only invaded Bavaria on the 10th of April, news reached Paris quickly, and Bonaparte left the capital almost immediately, arriving in Germany a week after the Austrians had commenced hostilities, to the surprise of many who still believed he was in France. There, he found matters arranged badly. Marshal Berthier had misunderstood Napoleon's orders, which he had sent ahead of him, and had consequently divided La Grande Armée, sending a force of just over 50,000 men north of the river Lech, with the other 68,000 French troops in southern Germany deployed south of the river. By the time Napoleon arrived at Donauwörth on the 17th of April, these two forces were out of marching distance of one another, and there was a risk that if Charles managed to engage either one by itself with the bulk of his 120,000 men, that he would so outnumber the French that he might destroy half of Napoleon's armies in Germany. Napoleon's response to the predicament he found La Grande Armée in when he reached southern Germany in mid-April was the Landshut maneuver, one of the most famous military maneuvers in history, the name of which is derived from it having played out near the town of Landshut, which the Austrians moved to attack around the time Napoleon arrived in southern Germany. Viewing this as an opportunity rather than a threat, Bonaparte sent messengers to Marshal Davout, who was several days' march distant, with a corps of French cavalry, with orders to rejoin the main army. He then positioned elements of La Grande Armée to break off the Austrian lines of communication back to Vienna, with the ultimate goal of trapping Charles and the Austrians in southern Germany and cutting off their route back to the Austrian capital. He achieved this spectacularly in the week that followed, with Davout and himself winning a series of battles, the most significant of which came at Echtmoul on the 22nd of April and Ratisbon on the 23rd. Napoleon suffered a wound to his ankle during the latter engagement. With these victories, Archduke Charles retreated away from the main French forces. Bonaparte had somehow managed to turn a difficult situation in southern Germany into another strategic campaign victory in just over a week. And with the success of the Landshut maneuver, the road to Vienna was free for Napoleon to advance yet again on the Austrian capital. It was just as well that Napoleon had managed to completely reverse the situation in southern Germany when he arrived there in mid-April, as the war had started badly for the French in the other theatres of it. A few days after Archduke Charles had advanced into Bavaria, A separate, smaller Austrian army had campaigned northeastwards against the Duchy of Warsaw under Archduke Ferdinand. This defeated Napoleon's Polish allies at the Battle of Raschen on the 19th of April, and then occupied Warsaw a few days later. The war at sea was also going poorly for the French, and new losses to the British during the War of the Fifth Coalition would lead to the French position in Haiti and the Caribbean once again becoming compromised. The one area of positivity for Bonaparte was in Italy, where his stepson, Eugène, Empress Josephine's son from her first marriage, led the French resistance to an Austrian encroachment under another member of the Austrian royal family, Archduke John. The Austrians were able to gain an initial victory at the Battle of Caldiero on the 30th of April, but thereafter, as French and Italian reinforcements arrived to strengthen Eugène's position, he was able to defeat the Austrians at the Battle of the Piave River in early May and force them back out of northern Italy. By the time that Eugène's forces were overcoming the Austrians in Italy, Napoleon was already advancing towards Vienna as the Austrian forces along the way attempted to fight a desperate rearguard action against La Grande Armée. The Emperor reached the Austrian capital on the 10th of May. His Polish aide-de-camp, Adam Czarkowski, later recounted an extraordinary moment upon his arrival there, where Bonaparte rode to within shooting distance of the city walls and was greeted by the Austrian troops removing their hats and cheering for the French Emperor, their ostensible enemy. Some French officers later informed Czarkowski that the same thing had happened when Napoleon had arrived at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in 1806. Such was the regard in which many people throughout Europe continued to hold Napoleon, even after years of war. The siege which followed, if such it can be called, was brief. After an artillery bombardment on the 11th and 12th of May, the city surrendered just after midnight on the 13th. Consequently, Napoleon entered Vienna as its conqueror for the second time in less than half a decade. This placed him in an extremely advantageous negotiating position, but as in 1805, he needed to win a decisive victory on the field of battle in order to bring the war to an end. By the time Napoleon entered Vienna, Archduke Charles had begun to regroup and bring his remaining forces from southern Germany back eastwards towards Austria. Napoleon was determined to defeat him in the field and end the conflict. To that end, he left the Austrian capital shortly after seizing it and was advancing towards where Charles lay to the north. Movement on the 19th and 20th of May was made difficult by the fact that most of the bridges over the river Danube had been destroyed and pulled down in advance of the French incursion into Austria. Facing attacks in his rear from the Tyrol region of western Austria, Napoleon nevertheless had his forces traverse the river in the early hours of the 21st. This done, he came into contact with the armies of Archduke Charles, which still consisted of over 95,000 men, arrayed between the villages of Aspern and Essling. The French and their allies were not much over 80,000. The ensuing battle of Aspern-Essling began on the afternoon of the 21st of May and lasted for over 24 hours of intense fighting centered on the village of Aspern. As a battle of attrition, the engagement was brutal, one of the bloodiest of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, and one of the most costly in lives that Napoleon, who had built his career on swift movements, which won engagements decisively by breaking the enemy lines without major loss of life, had fought. In the end, it was an Austrian victory of sorts, as Napoleon ordered a French retreat on the afternoon of the 22nd. By that time, he had lost nearly 20,000 men, dead and wounded, while Marshal Jean Lannes, one of Napoleon's most effective commanders and a personal friend, was badly wounded by a cannonball, forcing the amputation of his leg. In the midst of this brutal operation, in an age before effective anesthesia, Napoleon wept over Lannes, who died over a week later from his wounds. Napoleon visited him every day during his last illness. With the retreat from Aspern-Essling, Napoleon moved back towards Vienna to regather his forces. By now, Eugene had been successful in Italy, and Marshal Marmont, Napoleon's commander in the Dalmatian region, had also won out over a small Austrian force there. Both moved to join Bonaparte in Austria with reinforcements. As a consequence, Napoleon was able to recommence the campaign with over 170,000 men in late June, while Archduke Charles, for his part, had also gathered reinforcements, so that he had over 125,000 men at his disposal. What this indicates is the manner in which Napoleon's wars were leading to ever greater numbers of troops being deployed across Europe. When Bonaparte had first campaigned in Italy in the mid-1790s, a force of 30,000 or 40,000 men was large. By 1809, it was a token army that could not prove decisive on any front. As a result of this, it was nearly 300,000 men who took to the field at the Battle of Wagram, not far from Vienna, on the 5th of July, 1809. Both sides also had hundreds of pieces of artillery, and it was these combined factors which made the 2 days of fighting particularly bloody. By the time it ended on the 6th, both sides had suffered over 35,000 men killed and wounded. But with his superior army, Napoleon was able to claim victory, while the Austrian morale was broken in the aftermath of Wagram. Peace terms were soon being explored, though the fighting in the war of the Fifth Coalition between France and Austria's allies continued elsewhere. Early in the summer of 1809, the government in London had begun planning for the opening of a new front on the continent, one which would supplement the Peninsular War being waged in Spain and Portugal, but which would strike closer to the Napoleonic regime in Paris. The plan eventually decided upon was to launch an amphibious landing around the mouth of the River Scheldt in the Low Countries. This would serve multiple purposes. Firstly, it would allow the British to prevent the French using the port of Antwerp. Secondly, it was intended that the expedition would destroy French ships which might be amassing in Dutch and Belgian ports for a new invasion plan against Britain. And thirdly, and finally, it was imagined that a successful campaign might serve to draw some of La Grande Armée away from Germany and the Austrians and towards the Low Countries. All of these ambitions would fail, though. When the expedition under John Pitt, 2nd Earl of Chatham, the older brother of the recently deceased Prime Minister, William Pitt, arrived at Walcheren Island at the mouth of the River Scheldt, disease quickly broke out amongst the troops, most likely a type of typhus or dysentery. This crippled the British Expeditionary Force, and despite capturing the important port of Flushing, the Walcheren campaign ended in an ignominious abandonment in October following a counterattack by the French under Marshal Bernadotte and the retaking of Flushing. By the time the British were evacuating Walcheren and their other locations along the mouth of the River Scheldt, the Austrians were already finalizing the terms of their latest defeat against Napoleon, the 4th time they had been beaten by Bonaparte in 12 years. The result, signed as the Treaty of Schönbrunn at Schönbrunn Palace near Vienna on the 14th of October 1809, was arguably the most humiliating set of terms yet for the Austrian government. Under it, Austria lost one of its oldest territories, the Duchy of Salzburg in northern Austria, to Bavaria, while additional lands in the northeast of the Austrian Empire were ceded to Russia and the Duchy of Warsaw. But the greatest humiliation occurred in the southern parts of Emperor Francis's territories. Here, the region encompassing much of modern-day Croatia, Slovenia and Montenegro, as well as the port of Trieste on the Adriatic Sea, were ceded to Napoleon, who formed them into the Illyrian provinces, which were to be directly ruled as part of the French Empire, rather than shaping these into a vassal or puppet kingdom, as had been done in Holland, Italy, Germany, and with the Duchy of Warsaw in Poland. With this, Austria became a landlocked nation, without access to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, and was thoroughly demoted to the position of a second-tier power in Europe, much as had happened to Prussia at Tilsit 2 years earlier. Napoleon very nearly didn't live to see the Treaty of Schönbrunn signed. 2 days before it was agreed, his security guards had only just prevented the latest in the many assassination attempts against Bonaparte. This centered on a young German Lutheran by the name of Friedrich Staps, who had sought an audience with Napoleon on the 12th of October. When he had been refused, he had tried to barge through a crowd in the courtyard of the Schönbrunn Palace towards Napoleon, only just being apprehended before he could use the knife he was carrying. Arrested and questioned, Staps revealed that he had acted alone and had intended to kill the French emperor as a result of the suffering he had inflicted on Germany and Austria. Napoleon was relatively magnanimous in his offer of clemency if Staps would simply desist from his ideological madness and ask him to pardon him. Perhaps Staps' declaration in response that to kill the French ruler was not a crime but a duty would have alerted Napoleon to the changed public perception of him by the autumn of 1809, abroad if not yet in France. This may be why Bonaparte ordered that news of the assassination attempt be kept secret. Staps was executed less than a week later by firing squad after the treaty had been finalized and Napoleon had begun to make his way back to Paris. Napoleon's time in Austria was notable in one other respect. While there, he had renewed his relationship with Marie Walewska, the Polish noblewoman who had been influential in convincing him to create some of his newly conquered territories in the Duchy of Warsaw back in 1807. Marie visited Napoleon while he was in Vienna. It was undoubtedly during this renewal of the relationship that one of Napoleon's illegitimate children, Alexandre, who Napoleon had named in honor of the Russian Tsar, was born. Marie gave birth to him in Poland on the 4th of May 1810. Her husband, Athanasius, acknowledged the child as being his own, but any casual look at photos of Alexander, who lived in an age when the first cameras had become available, clearly shows him to be Napoleon's son. Moreover, shortly after the boy was born, Marie relocated to Paris, where Napoleon installed them in a house, proclaiming that he would, in the fashion which he had grown used to with family members, make the child a count. With the signing of the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the War of the Fifth Coalition effectively came to an end. On his return to Paris, Napoleon was preoccupied with one issue. His marriage to his wife, Empress Josephine, had not resulted in children and an heir. Additionally, Napoleon's young nephew, Napoleon Louis Charles Bonaparte, who was allegedly the son of Napoleon's brother Louis, and Josephine's daughter Hortense, had died in May 1807 at 4 years of age. Napoleon Louis had briefly been the emperor's heir designate, and this decision to promote his nephew in this way has given rise to speculation, which has never been fully proven or dispelled, that the emperor was actually the boy's father. Whatever the truth of his parentage, Napoleon Louis died in the early summer of 1807 from a respiratory illness, leaving the French Empire yet again without a clear line of succession. It was in this context that Napoleon informed Josephine in late November 1809 that they would have to divorce so that he might remarry and father an heir, Josephine having entered the second half of her 40s and it being clear that the marriage would not result in children now. The divorce was finalized at a ceremony in Paris on the 10th of January 1810. Josephine would remain on good terms with her ex-husband and was allowed to live with a large pension at the Château de Malmaison in Paris, carrying the title of Duchess of Navarre in the aftermath of their separation. With his divorce from Josephine, Napoleon was free to marry again. This was viewed as an opportunity not just to produce an heir, but also to diplomatically bind one of Europe's great royal houses to him and gain a firm ally in the process. The union, which was eventually agreed, was perhaps somewhat surprising. At first, Bonaparte had wished to marry Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna of Russia, a sister of Tsar Alexander I. But in 1809, when deliberations on a potential wife began, she was just 14 years of age, and the plan was always viewed tepidly by Bonaparte. Instead, it was quickly concluded that Napoleon would marry Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the eldest child of Francis II of Austria. Next to Britain, Austria had been the most stalwart foe of France ever since the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars nearly 2 decades earlier. But it had experienced nothing but defeat after defeat in 4 different wars since 1792, most of them directly at Napoleon's hand. The marriage alliance now held out the possibility of a lasting peace between the 2 nations. For Napoleon, it would neutralize Austria and perhaps make it an ally in conflicts with France's only 2 major enemies that were left unvanquished, Great Britain and Russia. For Francis, it offered the prospect that he would be treated favorably in the years to come and could perhaps reacquire some of the many territories he had lost to France, Bavaria, the Duchy of Warsaw, and Russia. After weeks of negotiations and diplomacy between Paris and Vienna in the early months of 1810, the terms of the marriage between Napoleon and Marie-Louise were agreed on, and they were married by proxy in Vienna on the 11th of March. Napoleon's new wife left the Austrian capital after 2 days and arrived in northern France 2 weeks later. There she met her husband for the first time, remarking that she was pleasantly surprised by his being more attractive than she had been led to believe, despite his growing corpulence. The formal religious wedding ceremony was carried out on the 2nd of April 1810 at the Salon Carré in the Louvre in central Paris, the day after the civil ceremony took place on the 1st of April. Weeks of celebrations followed in Paris to commemorate a union which ironically made Napoleon the great-nephew-in-law of King Louis XVI, who the French had launched their revolution 21 years earlier in opposition to. It would prove a successful marriage. Napoleon was devoted to his second wife, despite being twice her age at the time of their marriage. Most importantly, it quickly resulted in the legitimate male heir which Napoleon had long sought. By the early autumn of 1810, it was clear that the Empress was pregnant, and on the 20th of March 1811, she gave birth to Napoleon François Charles Joseph, Prince Imperial of France. While his divorce and second marriage might be regarded as personal and political successes, problems were mounting for Napoleon in other respects. He now ruled an empire which constituted territories ruled directly by France in much of the Low Countries, Western Germany, parts of Italy, and the Illyrian provinces around modern-day Croatia and Slovenia, while the sister kingdoms and vassal states ruled by his family members and allies stretched from Spain in the west to Warsaw in the east, and Holland in the north to Naples in the south. Rebellions might be viewed as inevitable given the rapid expansion of this empire and the growing nationalism of the era. But these were occurring with worrying frequency. For instance, even as he defeated the Austrians in the War of the Fifth Coalition in the spring and summer of 1809, a huge rebellion broke out in the Tyrol region of western Austria. It was led by Andreas Hofer, a local innkeeper, and was sparked by unrest about a mandatory vaccination program against smallpox, as well as the joint Franco-Bavarian occupation of the region. It took half a year and the dispatch of approximately 40,000 troops to the area to suppress it. A shorter-lived insurrection, known as the Gotchier Rebellion, struck the Illyrian provinces in the autumn of 1809. None of these revolts were successful, but they required Napoleon to commit men and resources to growing numbers of local revolts. More serious was the ongoing and seemingly insurmountable rebellion across the Iberian Peninsula. By 1810, the British, under Wellesley, had a permanent position in Portugal and southern Spain, while Joseph Bonaparte, the Napoleonic King of Spain, ruled from Madrid against a rival regime based in Cadiz in the south of the country. The Peninsular War, or Spanish Ulcer, was notable perhaps as the first major example of a counterinsurgency war in modern history, foreshadowing conflicts like the Vietnam War and numerous wars in Afghanistan from the mid-19th century onwards. 1810 saw a fresh injection of troops into the peninsula and the clearing of many of the Spanish positions in Andalusia and the south. But a French campaign in Portugal under Marshal Ney and Marshal Massena failed to dislodge Wellesley and his Portuguese allies, as French armies for the first time in many years began to lose engagements like the Battle of Busaco in September 1810 to a numerically inferior force. There were successes elsewhere, notably the recapture of most of Aragon and its cities in the spring and summer of 1811. But victory could not be obtained in Spain and Portugal, and by 1811 there were over 300,000 French and Allied troops stationed across the peninsula, many of them charged simply with maintaining lines of communication and supply between France and Spain, as the guerrilla nature of the war saw any unprotected French convoys quickly attacked by marauding Spanish rebels. Ultimately, Spain was costing Bonaparte far more than it was worth. While the French experience might have indicated to Bonaparte that he would be better off not trying to centralize control over disparate parts of Europe too extensively in French hands, he certainly didn't seem to show any appreciation of that fact, and in 1810 moved to incorporate ever greater parts of Europe directly into the French Empire and control them from Paris. In 1810, it was the turn of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. As ever, one of the major problems here was that his brother Louis, who had been made King of Holland by Napoleon in 1806, had proved a weak ruler, incapable of quelling specific types of unrest in the Netherlands and fending off the Valkyrian campaign by the British without extensive French intervention. Napoleon told him to abdicate in the aftermath of the campaign, but Louis refused, and even had the temerity to call the French occupation of the Netherlands illegal. Napoleon responded accordingly and forced his brother to abdicate in the summer of 1810 in favor of his 5-year-old son, but this arrangement lasted less than 2 weeks before Napoleon dissolved the Kingdom of the Netherlands and annexed the region directly into the French Empire. Of all the problems which Napoleon faced, though, in the aftermath of the War of the Fifth Coalition, one was entirely self-inflicted. The French emperor had imagined that the continental system would be the death knell of Britain without ever having to invade England itself. His goal was to cripple British trade and attack France's great nemesis economically. Moreover, he imagined that it would be popular across the continent as business people in France and elsewhere would benefit from increasing profits for their own industries and companies. But he was entirely wrong in this analysis. It was widely loathed across the continent and was not fully enforced anywhere. As early as the second half of 1807, just months after the system was formally adopted at Tilsit, the French government had placed an order with the textile companies of the great trading cities of northern Germany, which had been at the heart of the medieval Hanseatic League, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and Rostock, for hundreds of thousands of pieces of clothing for La Grande Armée. But the German manufacturers simply could not meet the demand for roughly 200,000 pairs of shoes, tens of thousands of greatcoats, and other clothes besides, without having resort to the English market. As a result, even as Napoleon was trying to enforce the continental system in the late 1800s, French soldiers were battling in the War of the Fifth Coalition in uniforms that had been made in industrial factories across northern England, in cities like Leeds and Blackburn. These problems extended all over Europe. Even Napoleon's own family members turned a blind eye to breaches of the regulations. In Holland, for instance, King Louis was well aware that the smuggling of goods from Britain into Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and other Dutch ports was occurring, but really made no effort to stop it, aware that to do so would arouse widespread discontent amongst his subjects. The system could never be fully imposed in the Iberian Peninsula, where the British Expeditionary Force under Wellesley and the Spanish and the Portuguese held many important ports. while in Italy, Murat, following his coronation as King of Naples, never tried to impose a ban on British imports, which was utterly impractical in a region with such a large coastline. Instead, the system bred corruption across Europe, as bribes to falsify paperwork or to look the other way when British contraband arrived at a port became everyday occurrences. And Britain also did everything it could to undermine the system, setting up smuggling stations in places like Malta in the Mediterranean, from which hundreds of ships ran smuggling operations throughout the late 1800s. By 1810, it was clear that all Napoleon was achieving was to arouse resentment amongst the mercantile and industrial classes, alienating himself from his foremost ally, Tsar Alexander, and decimating French customs revenue, which was collapsing owing to the volume of smuggling which was being carried out across France and its territories. The continental system was just one factor in the deteriorating relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander. In the aftermath of the War of the Fourth Coalition and the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Alexander had remained as the only continental European ruler who was still an equal of Napoleon's. All others, such as Emperor Francis of Austria and King Frederick William of Prussia, were now persistently in an unequal power dynamic when it came to any negotiations with France. Alexander was different, and in private he made it known that he was playing a long game to defeat Napoleon, whom he perceived as grievously overextending himself in trying to become master of Europe. He always made it known, though, that he would not tolerate excessive French interference in his country or demands by Bonaparte, and this focused primarily on the continental system. However, Napoleon's decision to negotiate a marriage alliance with Austria instead of Russia early in 1810 was another factor which accelerated the declining relationship between Napoleon and Alexander. So too was the increasing power of the French allied Duchy of Warsaw, which was effectively a resurrection of the Polish state just over a decade after the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian partitions of Poland had made Russia the dominant power in Eastern Europe. The ultimate collapse of the Franco-Russian alliance occurred at the very end of 1810, when Alexander announced on New Year's Eve that he was leaving the continental system and would no longer entirely restrict Russian trade with British merchants, though some blocks would still apply. Simultaneously, he ordered the imposition of customs duties on French goods entering Russia. Napoleon viewed this as a fatal betrayal, and from that point onwards, he was plotting war with Russia, while Alexander was clear that conflict sooner or later was inevitable. 1811 was spent by Bonaparte preparing for the invasion of the Russian Empire, with huge logistical operations underway across Germany and other parts of Central Europe to build up stores of military supplies and other provisions. Clear supply routes were created from France into Western Germany, and from there to the river Vistula in Poland. There were also escalating diplomatic tensions, notably in Napoleon's decision to remove the royal family from the Duchy of Oldenburg and annex the territory in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit, through which Alexander had sought to preserve the position of his cousins in Oldenburg. By early 1812, the declaration of war was imminent. At that juncture, a military alliance had been agreed between France and Austria, whereby the Austrians would have to provide some tacit support to the French when they invaded Russia. In mid-January 1812, Napoleon commanded Marshal Davout to invade Swedish Pomerania, the territory controlled by Sweden along the Baltic coast of what is now northeastern Germany and northwestern Poland. It was clear that this move was designed to strengthen Napoleon's position for an advance into Russia, though he attempted to explain the measure away simply as an operation to impose the continental system on the Baltic ports. In late February, Napoleon then forced King William Frederick of Prussia to sign a minimal alliance, whereby he would allow La Grande Armée to travel freely through Prussian territory and contribute a contingent of Prussian troops towards the war. The Prussian king reluctantly agreed. Following this, Alexander decided to accelerate the war's commencement by issuing a diplomatic demand in April 1812 for the French to remove their troops from eastern Prussia and the Duchy of Warsaw, as these were territories which Russia considered to lie within its sphere of influence, and that the continuing French presence here was a threat to Russia. Just weeks later, Alexander also agreed a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire to ensure its southern borders were secure once war erupted with France. He did not have to wait long. On the 22nd of June 1812, Napoleon made a famous speech to his troops arraigned in Prussia, in which he declared that Russia had violated the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit and implored his troops in the following way: "Let us then march forward. Let us pass the Niemen. Let us carry the war into her territory. The second war of Poland will be as glorious to the French arms as was the first. But the peace which we shall conclude will be its own guarantee, and will put an end to the fateful influence which Russia has for 50 years exercised over the affairs of Europe." 2 days later, on the 24th of June 1812, La Grande Armée crossed over the border into the lands of the Russian Empire. The die was now cast. Either Napoleon would defeat Alexander and become master of all continental Europe, or he would experience crushing defeat. Ahead lay the Russian winter. What do you think of Napoleon's conquests in the late 1800s? Should he have abandoned trying to impose the continental system and instead focused more on the threat the British posed through the Peninsular War? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.